This is the Halftime Show with Omar Al-Duri on Pulse 95.
Salam and welcome to the Halftime Show with Omar Al-Duri. I'm your host, covering everything sport, international and local. Hope you're having a blessed Saturday wherever you're tuned in around the world, whether it's 95 FM, pulse95radio.com, our app, Sharjah Broadcasting Authority, or even if you're tuning in at home, watching us live on YouTube. Right, okay. Now, we always talk about the different parts of the body that affect the brain, the mind, performance. This has 100% full importance on how we function. And on the show today, we're bringing in a specialist at Barefoot training. Right, okay, so who is this? Dr. Emily Splichal is going to be on the show today, a world-renowned podiatrist, a human movement specialist, and a unique barefoot training approach to 20,000 professionals in more than 35 countries. He specializes in that, and we're discussing today how they're all linked with performance, recovery, resetting, and longevity. On the only place to be at 3, the Halftime Show on Pulse 95.
This is the Halftime Show with Omar Al-Duri on Pulse 95.
Salam and welcome to the Halftime Show with Omar Al-Duri. I am your host, covering everything sport, international and local. Oh, I told you I bring you the best specialist in the world, and this is the first time I have this guest on the show who specializes in this thing on this show at this time today. On Saturday, you're getting it from 3 to 4 UAE time. I have the world-renowned podiatrist, human movement specialist, oh my God, author to Barefoot Strong. Her unique barefoot approach is over 20,000 professionals. She's touched their lives in over 35 countries. Dr. Emily Splichal, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much. I'm super excited and I love that intro.
We're just getting warm, and I can't wait to share you with the guests because they want to hear more about yourself. Tell us a little bit about what you do and how you got inspired to get into this.
Yeah, so I am a functional podiatrist in the US. I'm actually licensed in New York and Arizona. Currently live in Arizona in a desert. A little bit like UAE. And I'm also a human movement specialist. So what I do is I focus on movement imbalances, movement compensations, and chronic pain, specifically from the ground up. So I'm looking at the way that individuals are walking, relating to the ground, obviously factoring in sensory stimulation, which is really everything of how we relate to our body, our movement, and really this external environment in other people. So it's been quite the journey over the last 10 years, and it's really expanded, like you had said, to over 35 countries to help people look at feet differently.
How important are the feet to the way we function?
Clearly, they're everything. They're what I dedicate my career on, but they're really an underappreciated part of our body. I think because a lot of people just throw them in their shoes, they don't think about them, or they slide on some sort of sandal. They're this part that's actually really complex. And Hippocrates once said that it is this masterpiece of art. And I think that's based off of how complex that they are. From a mechanical perspective, every movement that we do, if you've ever heard, that the foot bone's connected to the leg bone, which is connected to the hip bone, right? It's kind of continues all the way up. But the other part of it is that the skin in the bottom of the feet is so sensory rich. There's thousands of nerves that are reading the ground and reading every single step that we take. So if we can access those nerves, you can actually improve the way that someone moves.
And when you were saying that, the first thing that came to my mind was there's so many things that trigger off. And we're always talking about going to the gym. We're always talking about going to the right places. We hardly talk about working the feet. Now, I know it works every single day, but how do we train the feet?
To train the feet, you want to think of them almost like how you train the core. So core training, for those that are kind of in the fitness space and are into maybe athletics, understands that your powerhouse is your center, your core, your abs, if people want to think of it that way. That years ago, people used to think about core as doing crunches, right? It's the six-pack muscles. It's this very superficial aesthetic look to the core. But really your core is much deeper. It's the pelvic floor. It's these small muscles that you can't touch. And they're hard for people to actually relate to sometimes because they can't see them, they can't touch them. So how do they know if they're contracting, right? Our foot is very similar to that in that there's these small, tiny muscles in the bottom of the feet that act like the deep core and the pelvic floor. There are stabilizers. They technically are supposed to be contracting before the larger muscles like our calves that we can touch, right? So that's why I think that there's this initial disconnect or disappreciation for the foot. Now, to strengthen the foot, you got to think of it like the pelvic floor and the deep core. It's very tension-based. It's isometrics. One of the best ways to strengthen the foot is what's called a forward lean. So you essentially just stand like you're stiff as a board and you rock the body forward just slightly, and you're going to feel your toes and your foot contracting. It's a postural correction that we do every day when we stand and don't really realize it. Another great way to strengthen the feet is standing on one leg. So just balancing, again, it's a postural move, right? Just standing on one leg, the foot has to constantly be contracting so that you don't fall over. And yes, there's these larger muscles of the hip and the lower leg that contract, but a lot of the deep foot muscles are also contracting during that exercise. So those are probably the two easiest to describe through audio. There's a lot of more intricate exercises for the foot, but I like to start people with that forward lean and a single leg stance.
I love the single leg stance, especially when it comes to sport-specific training, when it comes to sports. Out here in the UAE, they're crazy about their sports here. They love it, from mixed martial arts to football to cricket to basketball. I mean, rugby, they go crazy on that. And normally the single leg can really isolate things. But I read something on your page. I think it was something saying, get good at being bad. Talk to me about that. I love that. The light bulb went off when I saw that.
I totally wish that was my quote. But that's a Mike Fitch quote. Mike Fitch, the founder of Animal Flow, which he's a beautiful human being. I encourage everybody to look at Animal Flow and just to follow him as well. But what that quote means is that by putting yourself in these uncomfortable situations, we'll talk about movement, right? Movement skills, athletics, right? So by putting yourself in uncomfortable situations, you grow. So you grow in your awareness of yourself. You grow in your skill development, your coordination, dexterity, fine motor control, cognitively, peripherally, sensorily. So all of these different ways of how you can put yourself in new movement experiences where you humbly are learning this new skill, let's say, and you will start being bad at it because it's like a new language. So that really resonated with me because being in fitness for 20 years, I could probably teach every class. I was a gymnast for 13 years. So I have very high body awareness and body weight training experience. I was like, I could teach Pilates, I could teach yoga, I could teach, strength conditioning, all of this. So I needed to be in something that I didn't know anything about the language. I had to be bad at it. And for me, that was aerial silks, if you're familiar with it, which is Cirque du Soleil. It's beautiful, it's fascinating, it's mesmerizing, but it is like a language that I knew nothing about. And I had to be very humble at this and say, I'm used to being good at the athletics that I choose. And it was very, like I said, humbling, very personally growing. And it really forced me to be in the present moment, which is why I also like it. When you're really learning something new, you have to be in the present moment, which if you're familiar with flow and kind of the psychology of flow and controlling different emotional states like anxiety and things like that, the more you can be in the moment and appreciate the moment and just feel every component of this moment in time, you really grow. So that's why that quote really resonates with me.
Amazing. Coming up next, we're talking about barefoot. We're talking about footwear and how to reset that on the only place to be at 3, the halftime show on Pulse 95.
This is the Halftime Show with Omar Al-Duri on Pulse 95.
Salam and welcome back to the Halftime Show. I told you I would spoil you, and this guest is definitely doing that for you now. From just the first segment, we're now on to the second segment today. And if you do miss the show, don't worry, catch all of our podcasts on Apple, Spotify, SoundCloud. Or if you prefer a visual, head over to the YouTube channel, Pulse 95 Radio, and we are there. We have some fantastic guests covering some really important topics. And Dr. Emily is really adding her flourish to this show. Dr. Emily, thank you very much for being on the show.
Of course, I'm excited to continue talking to you.
So Dr. Emily, okay, barefoot strength, barefoot, it has a lot of things that are attached to it. On these sides of the world, they always think of the Vibrams, the footwear. Some people love it because it's different. Some people love it because it's got some science behind it. What's your take on that, and where do you stand on that?
Yeah, so I obviously love bare feet or barefoot science. That's the name of my book, Barefoot Strong. And what I started doing is exploring the science of being barefoot and the influence on movement back in 2010, which was part of that barefoot running boom. If you're familiar with that, that's when the 5 fingers came out. Nike Free had their shoes, and it was very much associated with barefoot equaling minimal shoes. Like, that's kind of the message that I felt was being put out by these footwear industries, because they want to sell shoes, right? So they wanted to sell a more minimal shoe. But barefoot means so much more than just wearing minimal shoes with less cushion, shoes with less structure, shoes that don't have a drop to them, so there's zero drop. What barefoot really is to me is accessing the natural mobility, sensory stimulation, and strength of the human foot. So that is really a lifestyle to me. Doesn't mean that I walk around barefoot and I don't wear shoes. To be barefoot strong as a lifestyle means that you are mobilizing your feet every day. You're recovering them, giving them a little bit of TLC. You are stimulating them truly barefoot by walking around your home, ideally walking outside if you can, because then you access the earth and the natural charges of the earth. This is called grounding. So something very healing about being outside barefoot. So I would absolutely love that to be it. And then the foot strength. So doing daily foot exercises, we'd mentioned a few, leaning forward or doing a single leg stand, spreading the toes, opening them up, touching the ground and gripping the ground. All of those are really part of natural foot health, and then making intelligent footwear choices. So that's how I kind of expand barefoot as a lifestyle versus it just representing minimal footwear.
And so we mentioned mobility, we mentioned strength, and we mentioned sensory stimulation. Those are the 3 pillars of foot training that you've mentioned. And with those, does that influence how often you're on your feet? Do you have the recovery periods to stay off your feet, for example? Are you moving your feet while you're sitting? How does that go about?
So foot recovery is a little bit more challenging than other parts of the body. This is also part of why foot pain can be very difficult to get rid of. And what I've learned being a podiatrist over the last 10 years is you have to understand the reality of the individual that you're working with that's experiencing foot pain. In this case, is their job might require them to be on their feet. They might have to walk to work. I practiced in New York City for 10 years. So understanding the reality of that person's day to day, right? So I like foot recovery that is done in small doses every day and is especially passive if it can be, meaning that can you be releasing your feet by standing on a golf ball, or at Naboso we have a Nero ball that splits into these 2 domes while you're brushing your teeth, while you're doing the dishes, right? So we're doing it multitasking while doing something else that you're going to do anyway. So I sneak it in versus saying, stop your day I want you to release your feet. Very few people are going to do that. The other way, as far as passive recovery, of why we developed our recovery socks at Naboso, is they have these little tiny textures that are massaging the feet. They're improving circulation to the feet, which is a big part of recovery. And you essentially just walk around, which you're going to do anyway, and you're recovering your feet. So I like to have easy, passive, consistent, lifestyle-based foot recovery. And I always tell my patients is consistency is the most important thing for recovery. I don't care what type of recovery it is, you have to be consistent. Small dose over a long period makes a bigger difference.
I like that. Now you've dropped and you mentioned Naboso. For the listeners that don't know, can you tell us more about that, please?
Yeah, so Naboso is a product line that I launched 4 years ago. We actually have an awesome distributor in the UAE, and they carry all of our products, which are insoles, socks, release tools, hand weights that have the same stimulation flooring. And all of the products are designed with these tiny little pyramids across them. I will show one for those
please.
that are actually in the video. There's tiny little pyramids across the surface of every single product that we develop. And those tiny little pyramids are like Braille. So they're stimulating the nerves in a very subtle way, just the way that your fingers would read Braille. The same nerve found in the feet is reading those pyramids, which then activates the brain and essentially says, here's my foot, I feel my foot, I'm massaging my foot, I'm stimulating my foot, I'm actually improving microcirculation. So there's all these powerful benefits to having texture, a very specific texture under your feet for activation, strength, and recovery, which is what we focus on at Naboso.
When you said the connection to the brain, I just went straight into the camera and thought, oh my God, that for me, because everyone, by nature, we all want that edge. We all want to make sure we're sharp. Can you tell me more about the connection from the feet to the brain?
So there's a part of the brain that controls our movement. And that part of the brain, it's in the front part of the brain. It's called your somatosensory cortex. Somatic means movement, right? Somatic body. So it's somatic sensory. Somatosensory means sensory information comes in, influences movement out. Sensory in, movement out. And the sensory stimulation that is being pulled into the brain is obviously everything that is external on your body. So you have your hands, you obviously have your arms, so you have all your skin, right? Skin is the largest organ in your body, is your skin. It is packed with nerves, right? You feel it. If I'm touching your arm, you feel it, right? You feel pain, right? So different sensations. Now, all different parts of the body have different levels of sensitivity that are going to feed into the brain. Some of the most sensory sensitive are the palm of your hands and the bottom of your feet. And there's a reason for that. The reason why your hands are so sensory sensitive is you got to manipulate things, right? You're thinking about, years ago, weapon manipulation. Now it's like buttoning a shirt. It is a surgeon doing very fine surgery on the spine, as an example, right? We have to have very acute dexterity within the fingers and manipulation. In the feet, the sensory has to do with, we stand on our feet and we walk. So it's in the control of posture and movement. And if you don't have sufficient sensory stimulation to either area, you either have trouble holding objects. So some people will just spontaneously drop something. That's part of a deficit in the hand. Or I'm sure some people may relate that if your typing is getting less accurate on the keyboard, you're kind of like, what's going on, right? If you were typing with gloves on and you normally don't, you would notice a difficulty in being accurate. And then in the feet, if you start to either disconnect from the ground, from the feet because of shoes or injury like neuropathy or a stroke, then your posture and your balance get compromised. So you start to fall, right? So that's how you can start to see this deviation. Of course, it's not just for medical reasons. We apply a lot of it to athletics. So high performing athletes, they're very in tune with their physical body. Subtle stimulation, they're able to perceive and react to very, very quickly on a subconscious level.
Amazing. Love that. All right, we're going to take a quick break and we'll be right back after this. Don't go anywhere, folks. See you in a bit.
This is the Halftime Show with Omar Al-Duri on Pulse 95.
Salam and welcome back to the Halftime Show with Omar Al-Duri and Dr. Emily. We are here talking about barefoot training, barefoot strength, recovery. We touched on, how important the feet is, not just to the body, but to the brain. And Dr. Emily, I got to ask you something. The idea of connecting the dots. There's so many things that we often hear. For example, let's throw something your way. Heat versus cold. What's better for the feet? We feel good at both of them sometimes. Sometimes you feel good when you you soak your feet in hot water with some Epsom salt, and sometimes you get into an ice bath and that feels good as well. Do we have different times for different phases for the feet?
That's actually a really good question. And I think that it would be situational specific. Mm-hmm. So if we are talking about, let's say, an acute injury, I just sprained my ankle, boom, you gotta ice it, because what you're trying to do, just based off of temperature, is you're saying, let me influence either vasodilation or vasoconstriction, right? So that vasodilation is a response to heat. If you're doing an Epsom salt soak, which I love to do, is you're obviously pulling in the magnesium from the Epsom salt. So it can be very good from a detox perspective, from a flushing of the system out. Obviously, to flush the system out, you have to have heat because you need to have dilation. The blood vessels have to be open. Whereas the ice bath causes the vasoconstriction, and ice is an analgesic. So you're essentially numbing the area, right? You're numbing the nerves while you're vasoconstricting. So let's say in an acute injury specific, I just gave the example of an acute ankle sprain. The reason why you would want to ice it right away is that you're trying to control the immunoinflammatory response. So as soon as we get an injury to the tissue, the body creates an immune response, which is actually inflammatory. People don't actually realize or often realize that inflammation when we cut ourselves or we sprain our ankle or you work out hard still crosses into the immune system as well because of how they regulate each other. It's actually called neuroinflammatory response. So by icing and creating that vasoconstriction, you can control the level of swelling or edema post-injury. Now, after workout, people love to do the ice bath because you're working and you're lifting and you're creating micro tears. That's technically an inflammatory response in the body. You're creating micro injuries. When something becomes a little bit more chronic, or maybe you've had like a massage and you're trying to support the lymphatic system and the detox, then I actually like the heat and the Epsom salt kind of mixed in there. And then honestly, I love contrast bathing. So going from heat, ice, and you're just playing with vasodilation, vasoconstriction, vasodilation. If you get the whole body submerged, now you're actually doing a cardiac response, like a true cardiac response, which is then tying into the vagus nerve and how your autonomic nervous system is regulated.
I was just going to ask you about the heat versus cold, and then you went straight into it. I was like, yes. Just that question.
You knew where I was going to go.
Yes. And then the next thing I was going to say, which I'm glad you did mention it, so I can ask you this question, was the importance of breath work to the feet, and whether that can help with fight or flight, help with anxiety. I know you've mentioned that in previous podcasts and posts. How important is breath work to the feet?
So I'm going to first reference how breath work is important to how we stabilize our feet. In not quite going into the fight or flight side of it yet, but so our feet are myofascially connected to our pelvic floor, right? So just through connective tissue, there's long chains of muscles in the body that are connected to each other. It's efficient. It makes sense. If you look at the amazing athletic performances that people are able to do, it makes sense the body has to be integrated. The muscles just can't contract fast enough otherwise. So there's a connection between the bottom of the feet, the deep pelvic floor muscles or the deep core muscles, and then it actually continues up into the diaphragm and then goes up into the tongue. So when I teach people to strengthen the feet and activate the feet, I never strengthen the foot in isolation, meaning push your toes down, do towel crunches, whatever other foot exercises you may be thinking of, and it's over there by itself. I'm always teaching foot is being contracted at the same time as me engaging my pelvic floor, because that's how it functions when I'm standing up in gravity. But because the pelvic floor is connected to the diaphragm, I have to cue the breath in some way. And the way that your breath is sequenced when your foot contracts is technically the exhalation. So the part of, let's take a squat as an example, where you would want to be really engaging your foot would be on the upward phase of a squat, right? You're loaded, let's say it's a back squat, you're going down. As you're about to push up, I need you to intentionally contract your foot, lift your pelvic floor because you need your glutes to engage, and then you're going to be exhaling as you lift up. So that fascial stack, in a sense, is part of how we build stability for dynamic movement. Okay, let's then take that to what you were asking as far as how does breath influence the foot? Where I see that and what first came to my mind is when I have patients with chronic foot pain, let's say a chronic plantar fasciitis, chronic Achilles tendonitis, things like that, and they're not responding, they're not getting better based off of recommendations that I would give the average patient. I know that the problem is actually not in the foot, that it's actually a stability issue further up, meaning pelvic floor and diaphragm, right? It's a top-down issue. Now, I'll do a breath assessment. I'll do a pelvic floor assessment. You can tell if people are engaging or not engaging. You can tell if people are breathing really supra-diaphragmatically, so they're kind of upper lobe breathers with their traps that they're using. Now, if they're breathing that way, that style of breathing is referred to as a sympathetic or a survival type of breathing, anxiety breathing, right? Accessory breathing. But what it's doing is it's actually disconnecting the pelvic floor and the diaphragm, which is making the center not stable. So if it's anxiety driven, let's say, then we really would need to explore, why is it driven through anxiety? Is there mental health training? It obviously becomes very complex, but to understand that the issue of the chronic foot pain is the breathing pattern, but the breathing pattern is based off of an emotional driver. So I need to have a team and appreciate that complexity of the human being in order for me to successfully treat them. To me, it's not just a foot disconnected from a human being. Everything has to come into play. And that's why I consider myself a functional podiatrist, because I appreciate that human being that's behind the foot.
Interesting. With the passion you have for human movement and the appreciation, obviously, that you have in association with the internal, how much of that contributes to our happiness?
I think movement ultimately is a part of almost every person's happiness, because socialization is part of happiness, right? Mm-hmm. What do you like to do in your free time? It could be walking your dog. It could be seeing a loved one. It could be running, right? So there's obviously this component of movement in what people would connect happiness to, right? Or satisfaction. And we are satisfied as human beings through a large part of socialization. That's part of being human, right? Mm. A higher level kind of central nervous system is based around socialization. So that's where I ultimately look at movement. And I often say that, movement is life, movement is sensory, life is sensory. Like these are kind of words that I really connect to. And then on my book, which is called Barefoot Strong, the subtitle is Unlocking the Anti-Aging Secrets to Movement Longevity. So I believe that part of, anti-aging medicine has to be anti-aging movement, because as we live longer, we want to live longer and look good, but we also want to move well.
Fascinating. Okay, we're going to have one more break and then we have our final segment, and then we're going to find out when she's back in the UAE, hopefully back in Sharjah, and also where you can follow her on the only place to be at 3, the Halftime Show on Pulse 95.
This is the Halftime Show with Omar Al-Duri on Pulse 95.
Salam, welcome back to the Halftime Show. Thank you very much for tuning in. It's been an absolute pleasure to have Dr. Emily Splichal on the show. Dr. Emily, I know I missed you when you came to the UAE, and we were back and forth, and we tried to get you into Sharjah, and we tried to get you into Pulse 95 Radio. But are you planning to visit this year, and do you have a rough idea when we can tell the listeners?
Yes, so I am hopefully coming back in June. So the middle of June and then middle of September for sure. So those 2 months is what I'm looking at to return.
Nice. And where can we follow you?
So I'm on social media, specifically Instagram. My Instagram handle is at Dr Emily DPM. So Dr Emily DPM. That's my personal page, but it's very educational based. A big part of what I do is part of my personal professional mission is to educate people. I consider myself an educator. And I put that out on social media. Also for Naboso, which are the sensory recovery products for the feet, is NABOSO_technology. That's our Instagram handle. You obviously can go to the website, which is naboso.com, naboso.com. I'd mentioned our distributor in the UAE, which is The Motion RX. So that's where that's the URL for the products there. I'm sure you could search it and it would come up. And then my podiatry website is just my name. So dremilysplichal.com. You know how to spell my last name. It's, again, Dr. Emily Splichal, or you could just Google. I tell people to Google Dr. Emily Barefoot, and a lot of stuff comes up. I do see patients all around the world because I do see virtual patients, and I can treat 99% of everything virtually because I've been doing it well before COVID. I was doing telemedicine.
Well, I'm telling you now, that Naboso cart better be ready for me because I'm going to stack up on those products after speaking to you today. Thank you so much for blessing us on the show. It's been an absolute pleasure, and I can't wait to have you here on Pulse 95 Radio in the heart of Sharjah with us here out in the UAE.
Thank you. It was such a pleasure.
If you liked this episode of The Halftime Show, drop a like and subscribe.
95.
Be sure to follow us on Instagram for all our daily updates and top stories.